Hi all, welcome back to environmental science. We're going to continue talking a little bit about evolution, ecology, kind of how those two tie together. We talked about sympatric and allopatric speciation and how that is determined by the ecological niche. Now we're going to kind of talk about coevolution and how things might evolve together in maybe symbiotic relationships, whether that be parasitism, mutualism, commensalism. There's lots of different ways that these interactions that can occur, but it drives this connectivity. Why this is important for environmental science is often we see things through a very narrow lens. Like maybe as scientists we go out and we see, all right, we've built a road here and it affects the population of, say, frogs from one pond to the other. But what role does that organism, those frogs, play in the ecosystem? Are they food for another organism? Are they eating other organisms? Do they provide some kind of nutrient for things that you might not think about, like when they lay their eggs in a pond, do 10% of the eggs become food for other organisms that we don't account for? All these things go into kind of our effect on the landscape, or the environmental science piece on the landscape. And so that connection between humans, the environment, and the organisms that rely on that environment. And that's really where coevolution comes into play. Coevolution is the adaptation of two or more species to each other. Okay, and so there's lots of examples of this. Sometimes that adaptation is somewhat of a negative one, or you have maybe something like a predator preying on another organism, and that prey has to adjust their either their behavior, so maybe they spend a lot of time watching for predators, or maybe through a long period of evolutionary time that prey has become faster, and so the prey has developed speed maybe over agility, or maybe they have developed speed over girth, and because of that maybe they produce less offspring than they would if they were really large. There's lots of situations, and then the predator has to react to the prey. If the prey is getting faster, the predator has to either get faster, or maybe the predator has to develop a different means of hunting or prey on something else. Okay? And when we're talking about evolution, we're not talking about individuals evolving. Individuals don't evolve. Populations evolve. So it's not by choice. These organisms are not evolving by choice. But let's take a prey item. Let's say we're talking about rabbits, and the rabbits are being preyed upon by foxes. Okay? The slowest rabbits are going to be consumed by the foxes. So the faster the rabbit is, the more of a chance that that organism lives to reproduce. And then its offspring are going to be faster, some of them, than the organisms that got consumed by the foxes. Okay? And then foxes will hunt those rabbits. And the fastest ones reproduce. And so over time, they get a little bit faster, a little bit faster, a little bit faster. Or maybe we're not talking about speed, maybe we're talking about cryptic, like coloration. And so organisms that match their background, the better you match your background, the less likely you are to be consumed by a predator, found by a predator. Okay? So there's all kinds of situations in which they're reacting to the predator. The predator, vice versa, is also adjusting. The predator that's slow and can't catch a rabbit is going to die of starvation or produce less pups. The fastest predator therefore will produce the most pups. And over time, predators become faster. Or if we're not talking about speed and we're talking about cryptic capabilities, the predator with the best eyesight, or maybe the predator with the best smell, or maybe the predator with the best ability to hear are the predators that are going to survive. And so a lot of times we consider predator-prey interactions not just coevolution, but we often will consider it what we call an evolutionary arms race. So if you think maybe back to the Cold War, we'll build, weapons of mass destruction, and they'll build massive weapons of mass destruction. We'll be more, and back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Predator-prey interactions, same way. That's where really we get it, like the evolutionary arms race. So you're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And this happens over a long period of time. But the same thing happens in plants and animals, and the same thing happens in parasites. So let's look at an example here, like pollination. So most of the time we think about pollination happening from insects, maybe the wind, the water, but a lot of pollination, especially that happens at night, happens via bats. Okay. So if a cactus, like this cactus here, if it's the saguaro cactus, if it's going to entice a pollinator like a bat, it has to either trick or entice the bat to come in. And so they can produce some nectar down deep in here, and kind of like a nectar gathering tube or sac, and the bat would have to stick its rostrum, its head, into the flower. You can see the pollen that's hooked onto the whiskers and kind of the fur of the bat, and that would be transferred from this flower to another flower to another flower, on and on and on, as the bat feeds on the high sugar content in that nectar. Okay? But this is kind of a evolutionary arms race also. If the bat itself can develop maybe a longer tongue, so it doesn't have to stick its head down into the flower, then maybe it would. Okay? The individuals that don't have to stick their heads down in the flower, maybe they can slurp up that nectar without spending a lot of time with their head deep in a flower. That gives them a distinct advantage. When your head's in a flower, you're exposed to predators. So that gives you a distinct advantage. For the flower, that's a disadvantage, because now you're not getting pollinated. So maybe for long-tongued organisms, maybe the nectar is even further down in a sac. And so remember, these organisms aren't choosing to do this. There's just diversity within the population, and if it gives you a distinct advantage, you're going to reproduce more often, and your offspring is going to have that distinct advantage. Okay? The other cool thing about pollination that occurs like by bats or nocturnal organisms like moths. Moths will often pollinate flowers in the nighttime also. Most of the flowers are white, and what we now found out is that white coloration in fact is actually producing UV wavelengths, and so they're reflecting UV wavelengths. So a lot of the pollinators at night actually see UV, and so maybe this flower actually glows like blue or purple under UV light, or would look like a glowing beacon on the landscape. And to us, it looks like a white flower at night, but to other organisms it's not. And those are other ways at which you have this coevolution going on. The flower wants something to come visit it and transfer its pollen to another flower. In turn, it has to trick or provide some kind of resource to get the organisms there. And then the organisms that are visiting it, they're not really interested in transferring pollen. They're rather there for a meal. And so you got this coevolution between the two organisms. Okay? Lots and lots of cases of coevolution. Symbiotic relationships, normally we're talking about organisms that can't live without each other. Okay, so, or at least when they live apart from each other, they do worse. Maybe they have less offspring, maybe they have a shorter lifespan, lots of different things. Okay, and so symbiotic relationships can happen in many different ways. You can have kind of three main categories of symbiosis, and that's mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. And so depending on what organisms we're talking about will depend on whether we label it as mutualism, parasitism, or commensalism. On top of that, I want you guys to just remember that things switch very quickly from mutualistic interactions to commensalistic interactions. In other words, you might think that both organisms are mutually benefiting, but the second one organism can get the upper hand, the second that flower puts nectar so deep in a flower that nothing can reach it. They can smell it, but they can't reach it, and they can't actually get to the nectar. Now it's not a mutualistic interaction. Now it's a commensalism interaction. One organism benefits and the other one is neutral. There's really no cost to the organism. That case could be considered parasitic potentially, because one organism benefits and there is a cost to the other organism. And we'll look at some examples of this. So mutualism, and a great example of mutualism from a terrestrial habitat would be things like aphids. So here you can see these woolly aphids that are on this plant, and you can see these ants that are tending to the aphids. Okay, so the ants aren't eating the aphids. In fact, the ants are guarding the aphids from predators. In return, the aphids produce what we call honeydew, which is this little drop of semi-liquid material that has a lot of carbohydrates in it, sugar, and the ants consume that. And so basically the ants are somewhat farming the aphids, but in return they protect the aphids. And so we sometimes call that a mutualistic relationship. Both individuals benefit from that interaction. There are lots of others that sometimes we label it. So sea anemones and clownfish, often we label that as a mutualism relationship, although it could be considered maybe commensalism. So yes, clownfish benefit a great deal from laying their eggs and being associated with sea anemones, because sea anemones have stinging or at least sticky nematocysts or nidea that occur on their tentacles, and that provides protection to the clownfish. What do the clownfish provide in return? It's possible that, by defecating in the region, that some of the nutrients are picked up by the sea anemones. Now, sea anemones are predators, so they actually consume material, and they're not filter feeders, so it's highly unlikely actually that the anemone gets much in return from the clownfish. But it's possible the clownfish removes parasites, eats smaller fish that might be consuming or trying to consume the anemone. So it is possible that there is a mutualistic relationship there. But this is a good example of mutualism, when ants are basically farming the honeydew that's produced by aphids. Aphids in return get predators, or get protection from predators, and kind of have a mutualism. But indeed, this turns very quickly to commensalism if there are no predators on the aphid in the region. So if you did this in a closed system and the aphids have no predation risk or anything like that, the ants are still going to continuously farm those aphids. And even though there may be no threat whatsoever, the aphids then would get absolutely no benefit, and they would just be consuming material and producing it for the ant itself. Parasitism, we've talked about it before. That's normally when one species benefits at the cost of another. Now, parasites don't typically kill their hosts. Okay? Now, sometimes we see parasites get into the wrong host or the inappropriate host, not the intermediate or the primary host, but a host that's not specific to that organism, and that host dies. Okay, and that does happen. But parasitism in general, the life cycle of parasites, is to involve a host, but without killing the host, you're taking nutrients from them. So you are harming them, you are stealing nutrients from them, but you're not ultimately killing them. Okay, so it's similar to predator-prey, and in some cases it's been labeled predator-prey, but parasites, like I said before, they usually do not kill their host. Other things, like we can talk about parasite cycles if you're interested. There are lots of parasite cycles where different stages of the parasite are associated with different organisms. So maybe they have a stage of the parasite that's associated with a snail, and then they might have a stage that's associated with a fish, and then there might be a stage that's associated with a bird or a mammal, and that completes this cycle. So you have multiple hosts, none of which are often killed by the parasite, but rather they keep a different stage of the parasite's life cycle inside of them. Sometimes the energy cost to the host is very low, and then sometimes it's extremely high, and we can look at examples of this as we progress. Okay. Parasitism can be kind of broken up into 3 or so main categories. You have external parasites, which are often called ectoparasites. And these parasites are going to occur on the outside surface of an organism. Sometimes parasitoids get labeled this because they're going to lay their eggs within a living host. In this case, that is more of a predator-prey reaction, because those organisms that lay their eggs inside a living host, parasitoids like wasps and flies, will often destroy the host tissue and sometimes kill the host even. Okay? Then you have internal parasites, which are normally known as endoparasites. And so these can be all kinds of things like blood flukes, tapeworms, trypanosoma, malaria, all kinds of things fall into internal parasites. And then you have this kind of unique but nonetheless really interesting type of parasitism, and that's what we call brood parasitism. And that's where instead of raising your own young, you trick another organism to raise your young for you. So it happens a lot in birds, but there are other organisms that can complete this, and that is like, a classic example are cuckoos or cowbirds, and they will lay their eggs inside a nest of another bird. The egg is typically colored similar to the bird's eggs, the native bird's eggs. And so maybe the native bird doesn't know the difference between the eggs, or maybe the native bird lays their eggs in kind of a cup, and it's very difficult for that bird to remove eggs from that cup. And so by doing so, you trick this bird into raising your young. And so things like cowbirds and cuckoos, they never even build a nest. They actually don't have the capability of building a nest. And so there's all kinds of situations and interesting types of parasitism out there. Okay? All right, commensalism is when one organism benefits and the other organism is not hurt or helped. And so lots of tropical fish, like I said before, and sea anemones are good examples of this. But then again, like I said before, there is really no clear-cut boundary between commensalism and mutualism. And to tell you the truth, parasitism and predator-prey interactions. A parasitic event can turn predator-prey very quickly. If a parasite invades a prey or a host that has very little energy, it can kill the host. And then it's a predator-prey reaction. The boundary is very flexible. And that's great because organisms in general are flexible in their environment. And so if you can take advantage of an organism that you might have a mutualistic relationship with and turn it to commensalism, then the organism is going to do it. Predator-prey interactions, okay, we've already talked about this. Predation is consuming another organism. There's lots of laboratory conditions, predator population cycles. Probably the best cycle that is known or typically associated with predator-prey cycles or population cycles is the snowshoe hare and lynx cycle. And so if you check this out, you can see that because these two are linked, the snowshoe hare and the lynx are linked in Arctic environments, you can see like over a time period as snowshoe hare populations increase, shortly after that the lynx population increases. Then as the lynx population increases, it causes a crash in the snowshoe hare population, and then a crash in the lynx population. And what this is a sign of is the two populations are directly related to each other. Okay? That as you have more hares on the population or on the landscape, the lynx can consume more hares and produce more babies. And then as you have less, the lynx has less food. And so this goes back and forth, and these are predator-prey cycles. And you can see they fit each other very well. For many, many years, this has been tracked. Okay. Excuse me. The last thing I want to talk about is mimicry. So mimicry is interesting because organisms will evolve to mimic certain things. Okay, so in something like a Batesian mimicry, that's when one organism that is palatable, meaning you can consume it and without poison, mimics another organism that is poisonous. So viscera butterflies and monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies are poisonous. Okay? Viscera butterflies look very similar to monarch butterflies, but they're not poisonous. And so this is based on, often visual cues that a predator will be looking at maybe two butterflies, and one looks like a monarch, the other one looks like a monarch, and they just won't eat either one because of the chance that they'll be poisoned by that material. That's called Batesian mimicry. Now, the reason why it's important for evolution, or from an environmental science perspective, is what if you remove or allow monarch butterflies to go extinct? They're a threatened species due to poor habitat, not enough milkweed, things like that, probably pesticides, insecticides are doing a number on them also. Okay? So let's say their population are in decline, and in certain regions there are no monarch butterflies. Well, that viscera butterfly that spent millions of years to mimic a toxic butterfly is now at a distinct disadvantage. So you should expect the viscera butterfly to eventually decline also. Okay? Malurian mimicry is similar, except for normally this is based on a vision of like a venomous predator. Okay, so it's a color related So things like king snakes and coral snakes. Coral snakes are poisonous, king snakes are not. And it's this color pattern of red, yellow, and orange. Red, yellow, and black. And so, depending on the pattern, it can trick a predator into thinking you're venomous, and so they leave you alone. So, it's a warning sign. And Mullerian mimicry happens all over the time. This is why organisms are red, orange, yellow and black, because they're mimicking species that are colored in that way, that are venomous or poisonous. So it's a pattern, a color pattern, not a direct mimic of each other, but it's rather just the patterning of colors that is mimicked. And so you might have a different band color. So going back to king snakes and coral snakes. So coral snakes, there's a saying that red and yellow, so if it goes red, yellow, then you're a dead fellow. That means don't touch snakes that have a red, yellow patterning. If it's red and black, then it's a friend of Jack. That's how the saying goes. So red and yellow, you're a dead fellow. Red and black, friend of Jack. And so this is, this patterning, though, for humans, we can tell the difference. But for a lot of predators, they can't tell the difference. So that red-yellow, they stay away from it. The red-black, they still stay away from it, because that's Mullerian mimicry. Okay, so with that, when we come back and talk, about the next topic, we're going to talk about how populations change over time. So we're going to do a little bit of population ecology, ways at which we can predict where populations are going, which is hugely important for an environmental science perspective. You got to know how your environment's changing, and then what's changing in the environment. Is the population declining, increasing, and how do we predict it over future populations? Yeah, next time.